At 7:14 on a Tuesday morning, Vanessa Crowley stood in the middle of Briarwood Cove, screaming that I had destroyed her car, and I will admit from across the street it probably looked bad. Her graphite grey Mercedes sat crooked on a pair of heavy-duty wheel skates near the curb. Its front end pointed away from my driveway for the first time in nearly a month, while her expensive sunglasses were hanging halfway off one ear, and half the neighborhood watched from behind coffee mugs and window blinds. She kept pointing at me like I was some wild man with a wrench, shouting, "You think you can touch my car and get away with it, Graham?" And I just stood there in my slippers, holding a cup of black coffee, thinking how strange it was that she had finally noticed what it felt like to lose control of where you could go. But I am getting ahead of myself, because none of that started with a Mercedes, or a driveway, or even the Briarwood Cove Homeowners Association. It started years earlier, when my wife Elise and I bought the little cedar-sided house at the bend of Laurel Ridge Lane, back when the neighborhood still had more oak trees than security cameras and people waved at each other because they meant it. We had been married 36 years by then, and Elise had a way of making every place we lived feel like it had been waiting for us. The first thing she noticed about that house was not the kitchen, not the view, not the price. It was the old brick path leading from the driveway to the front porch. She stood there with both hands on her hips, looking at those uneven red bricks like they were treasure, and said, "Graham, this house has bones." That was Elise. I saw leaking gutters and a roof that needed work. She saw bones. We spent the next 20 years putting ourselves into that place one weekend at a time. I rebuilt the garage workbench. She planted hydrangeas by the mailbox. I repaired the fence after a windstorm. She painted the porch swing pale yellow because, according to her, every old porch needed one cheerful thing on it. And after we saved for almost 2 years, we replaced the cracked asphalt driveway with grey stone pavers that curved gently around the maple tree near the sidewalk. I remember kneeling beside her late one evening, both of us sore and dusty, looking at those stones in the fading light. She squeezed my hand and said, "Now it looks like home." After she passed, I did what a lot of men do when they do not know what else to do with grief. I kept busy. I polished the porch rail. I trimmed the hydrangeas too carefully. I pulled weeds no one else could see. I kept the driveway clean enough that sometimes I could still picture Elise standing at the mailbox in her gardening gloves, shaking her head at me for fussing over stones. So when people ask why I took Vanessa Crowley parking in front of my driveway so personally, I usually tell them it was not about a driveway. That is the easy answer. The honest answer is that it was the last part of my life with Elise that still looked exactly the way she left it, and Vanessa had decided that was the place she was going to make her point. Briarwood Cove had an HOA before Vanessa arrived, of course, but it was the kind most people barely noticed. We had annual meetings in a room behind the library. Someone brought stale cookies. Someone else complained about leaves blowing across property lines. And eventually, everybody went home. There were 39 houses, a small playground, a pond that smelled worse in August, and a wooden sign at the entrance that always leaned a little to the left, no matter how many times someone straightened it. It was not exactly Versailles. Then Vanessa moved in. She bought the biggest house on the cul-de-sac, painted it a color I can only describe as expensive gray, and within 6 months she had become HOA president. She was one of those people who never seemed to walk anywhere casually. Even taking her dog out looked like a campaign appearance. She wore pressed athletic clothes, carried a phone in one hand and a stainless steel tumbler in the other, and spoke in a tone that made every ordinary sentence sound like a performance review. "We need to elevate the neighborhood standard," she said at her first meeting. "We need to think about property values." Now, I have nothing against property values. I like my roof not leaking, I like my street reasonably clean, and I do not need a broken-down refrigerator sitting in anybody's front yard. But Vanessa did not care about the neighborhood. She cared about control, and there is a difference. The first time I really saw it was at the budget meeting that winter. She had proposed a special assessment for a new stone entrance sign, decorative lighting, and something she called a premium landscape refresh. The total was $28,000. Meanwhile, the drainage ditch behind the playground had been overflowing every time it rained hard, and old Mrs. Carver had nearly stepped into it while walking her terrier. I raised my hand and asked why we were spending thousands on uplighting a sign, when the neighborhood had a ditch that could swallow a toddler after a thunderstorm. Vanessa smiled at me in that polished way people smile when they are trying not to show their teeth. "Mr. Mild, Weller, she said. With respect, not every decision can be made based on the loudest concern in the room. I remember looking around because I was the only person who had spoken. Then I asked whether the landscaping company she wanted to hire had submitted competitive bids. That was when her smile changed. Not much. Just enough. Her brother-in-law owned the company, which did not automatically mean anything crooked, but it did mean the question was fair. Vanessa did not like fair questions. The assessment got delayed. The drainage ditch got repaired first. And from that point on, every time Vanessa looked at me, I could feel her remembering that meeting. At first, her little punishments were harmless enough to laugh at. I got a warning because my recycling bin was visible from the street for maybe 20 minutes after pickup. I got another one because the antique pickup truck I was restoring had been parked halfway outside my garage while I worked on the brakes. The truck was a faded blue 1966 Ford F100. Not much to look at yet, but it belonged to a friend of mine who passed away, and I had promised his daughter I would bring it back to life. Vanessa called it an unfinished visual disruption. That phrase still makes me laugh. An unfinished visual disruption. I told my neighbor Pete Larkin about it, and he said, that woman could write a parking ticket for a cloud. Pete was a retired electrician with a loud laugh and a habit of wearing sandals in weather that did not call for sandals. He had lived across the street from me for 18 years, and he knew exactly what Vanessa was doing. She wants you to snap, he told me one morning while pretending to check his mailbox. Then she can tell everyone you are the problem. I shrugged it off at first because I had lived long enough to know that most small people eventually trip over their own ego. But Vanessa was not just small. She was patient, organized, and very comfortable using rules as a weapon. The parking started on a Monday in late August. It was one of those bright, quiet mornings where the sun comes up soft and low and makes every lawn look better than it deserves to. I had an appointment at the parts shop across town, so I stepped outside with my coffee, headed toward my truck, and stopped cold. Vanessa's Mercedes was parked directly across from the opening of my driveway, not completely blocking it. Not enough for the police to call it illegal, but close enough that I had to reverse out at an angle and swing wide into the street. If someone came around the bend too fast, I would be halfway in their lane before I could even see them. Her own driveway was empty. The curb in front of her house was empty. The visitor area near the mailbox cluster was empty. She had parked there because she wanted to park there. I walked across the street and rang her bell. She opened the door wearing a white zip-up jacket, spotless sneakers, and an expression like I had interrupted an important briefing. "Morning, Vanessa," I said. "Would you mind moving the Mercedes back a little? It is making it hard for me to get out." She looked past me at the car, then back at me. "That is common curb space," she said. "I am allowed to park there." "I am not saying you are not allowed," I told her. "I am saying it is close enough that I have to swing into the road to leave my own driveway." She took a sip from her tumbler and gave a little shrug. "You have a large driveway, Graham. You will manage." Then she closed the door. No apology, no explanation, just that. "You will manage." Then she closed the door. No apology, no explanation, just that. "You will manage." I stood there for a second, looking at my own reflection in the dark glass of her storm door, and I remember thinking maybe she was having a bad morning. People have bad mornings. I had plenty after Elise died. So I backed out carefully, folded my side mirror in, and went about my day. The next morning, her Mercedes was there again. Same spot, same angle, same little gap between her rear bumper and the first edge of my stone pavers. On the third day, I knocked again. She did not open the door this time. Her voice came through the intercom beside the frame. "It is legal parking, Graham. Please stop bothering me." I looked up at that little black camera lens and something clicked in my mind. It was not parking, it was theater. She was not trying to get somewhere, she was trying to make me perform. She wanted me frustrated, late, angry, maybe reckless. She wanted me to do something she could use against me. So I did what I always did when a machine started making a sound I did not understand. I stopped guessing and I started watching. The next morning, I took a photo. Then another the day after that. Wide shot, close shot, timestamp, angle from the street, angle from the driveway. I did not tell anyone I was doing it. I did not make a scene. I just began collecting the truth, one quiet morning at a time. Meanwhile, Vanessa kept turning the screw. One morning, she parked so close I had to back out in 3 separate moves. Another morning, she stood on the sidewalk with her little white dog, watching me maneuver around her car, and smiled like she had bought a ticket to a show. "Careful," she called out. "That Mercedes is not cheap." I stopped my truck, put it in park, and rolled down the window. "Neither is my driveway," I said. Her smile faded for half a second. Then she leaned down slightly and said, "Maybe you should have thought about that before making things difficult for the board." There it was. Not a misunderstanding, not a curbside dispute. She had been carrying that budget meeting around for months, waiting for a place to put it. I went to the next HOA meeting with a folder under my arm, and every intention of keeping my temper. Vanessa arrived early, of course, with a stack of papers, and that sharp little smile she wore whenever she thought she had arranged the room in her favor. The meeting started with the usual nonsense: sprinkler schedules, trash cans, a complaint about teenagers fishing at the pond, and then Vanessa cleared her throat and said, "Next, we need to discuss several compliance issues related to the Weller property." I had to admire the confidence. She had turned a parking complaint into a trial against me before I could even open my folder. She listed the Ford truck, the recycling bin, a shutter she claimed was fading, and a patch of grass near my side fence she said showed inconsistent growth. Inconsistent growth. Inconsistent growth. I looked at Pete, who was sitting 2 chairs down, and he had both lips pressed together, trying not to laugh. When it was my turn, I stood up and laid the photos on the table. "I would like to discuss a repeated pattern of targeted parking outside my driveway," I said. Vanessa did not even look at the photos. "That is public curb space," she said. "You cannot dictate where another resident parks." "I am not trying to dictate," I said. "I am asking this board to recognize a repeated act that is creating an unsafe exit from my property." "That is your opinion," she replied. "No," I said, tapping the stack of photos. "This is evidence." The room went quiet. For a moment, I thought maybe one of the other board members would speak up. Then Mr. Hamley, who had been on the board longer than anyone, shifted in his chair and said, "I've seen the car there several times. It does seem excessive." Vanessa turned her head toward him so slowly it was almost impressive. "Are you suggesting," she said, "that I am intentionally harassing a resident?" Mr. Hamley looked down at his papers. "No, I am just saying perhaps it would be neighborly to park elsewhere." Vanessa gave a soft laugh, like he had said something charming but foolish. "We cannot govern based on personalities." That was the moment I understood why everyone in Briarwood Cove had been so quiet. She had trained them to be quiet, not with threats you could record, not with anything dramatic, just with that steady pressure people use when they want everyone around them to doubt themselves. By the time the meeting ended, I had been told my truck needed to be moved completely inside the garage within 10 days. My shutter might need repainting, and my concern about the Mercedes would be noted for future discussion. Future discussion! That was HOA language for go home and forget it. Outside, Pete caught up with me near the parking lot. "You all right?" he asked. "I am fine," I said. "No, you are not," he said. "You are doing that quiet thing." I looked at him. "What quiet thing?" "The thing where you look like you have already fixed an engine in your head and nobody else knows it yet." I laughed at that, but he was not wrong. I went home, poured myself a glass of iced tea, and sat at my kitchen table as the light faded across the pavers. I could hear the old wall clock Elise had picked out ticking above the doorway, slow and steady, the same way it had ticked through birthdays, storms, arguments, and long Sunday dinners. I thought about calling the police, and the next morning I did. The officer who arrived was young, polite, and clearly hoping the call would be over in 5 minutes. I showed him the photos. I explained how close the car sat, how I had to pull into the street blind, how it had happened almost every day for 3 weeks. He nodded, looked at the driveway, looked at the Mercedes, and finally said, "Sir, I understand why you are frustrated, but she is not technically blocking the driveway. I cannot issue a citation." "So she can do this every morning?" I asked. He hesitated. "Legally, she can park there. If you believe it is harassment, keep documenting it. Keep documenting it." That was all he could give me. When he walked over to talk to Vanessa, she turned into an entirely different person. Her arms folded loosely, her voice soft, her face concerned. I could not hear everything she said, but I heard enough. I had no idea he was so upset. "I am just trying to park close to my house. I would never intentionally inconvenience a neighbor." Then she glanced across the street at me, and for just a second, the mask slipped. It was not a smile exactly. It was worse. It was the look of someone who believed they had just won another round. The next morning, she parked even closer. I stood on my porch with my coffee, staring at the Mercedes, then at the empty curb in front of her own house, then at the small black camera over her door. I did not knock. I did not call the HOA. I did not call the police again. I went into my garage, pulled an old blue binder off the top shelf, and set it on my workbench. Then I opened it, slid in the first row of photographs, and wrote across the front in black marker, Crowley Parking Record. I had spent most of my life fixing things by taking them apart slowly, carefully, one piece at a time, and standing there in that garage with Elise's old porch light glowing through the window, and Vanessa's Mercedes sitting right where she knew it should not be, I realized something simple. Vanessa Crowley thought she was playing a game of pressure. She had no idea I had just started keeping score. The first thing I learned after I started that binder was that Vanessa Crowley was not nearly as careful as she thought she was. People who like control usually think they are invisible when they are being cruel, but they are not. They leave patterns everywhere. By the end of that first week, I had photographs of her Mercedes in front of my driveway at 7006, 7018, 7022, 7011, and once at 6:49 in the morning, which told me she had gone out of her way to park there before the rest of the street was awake. I had video of myself trying to back my truck out while a delivery van came around the curve, forcing me to stop halfway into the road. I had a picture of Vanessa standing at the corner with that little white dog in her arms, watching me struggle, and another of her looking directly into my security camera after she parked. That last one mattered more than anything. People do not stare into a camera unless they know exactly what they are doing. Every morning I made coffee, stepped onto the porch, took my pictures, got into my truck, and carefully made my way out of the driveway. I did not say a word to her. I did not knock. I did not send another email to the board. I gave her nothing to twist around, and just like Pete predicted, the moment I stopped reacting, Vanessa got bolder. She started leaving the Mercedes there longer. Sometimes it would sit from early morning until dinner. Other times she would park it at a slight angle, just enough to make the exit worse, then walk past my house in the afternoon like she'd forgotten it was there. One Friday she stopped near my mailbox while I was pruning the hydrangeas. She did not look at me at first. She looked at the flowers, then at my porch, then at the driveway. "You know, Graham," she said, in that calm little voice she used when she wanted everyone around her to feel less important, "you would probably be happier if you stopped treating every minor inconvenience like a personal attack." I kept clipping dead leaves for a few seconds before I looked up. "And you would probably be happier if you stopped creating them." Her face tightened. "Not much, just around the mouth. You are becoming difficult to work with." "I am not trying to work with you, Vanessa," I said. "I am trying to leave my house without putting my truck into oncoming traffic." She looked toward the street and gave that familiar shrug. "The curve is common space." "So is the pond," I said. "That does not mean you get to park in it." For the first time, I saw something in her eyes that was not irritation. It was anger. Clean, bright anger. The kind that comes from being laughed at by someone you have already decided is beneath you. She stepped closer and lowered her voice. "You should be careful, Graham. You are making this neighborhood uncomfortable." I almost laughed because there it was again, the trick people like Vanessa use when they do not want to answer for what they have done. They make you responsible for the discomfort they created. I looked at her and said, "No, Vanessa, I am making you uncomfortable. There is a difference." She walked away without replying, her dog tugging at the leash, her shoulders stiff beneath that spotless jacket. I watched her go, then went inside and added a note to the binder. Friday, 4:42 p.m. Verbal statement. Possible retaliation. It felt strange at first, writing things down like that. I had spent my whole life believing that if you were decent to people, eventually decency came back around. Elise believed that too. She used to say, "You never know what someone is carrying, Graham, so do not add weight to their arms." But Elise also believed in boundaries. She was kind, not foolish. There is a difference there too. A few days later, Pete came over with a folded lawn chair under one arm and a 6-pack of root beer under the other. He sat in my garage while I pretended to adjust the timing on the old Ford, even though there was not much to adjust. He watched me slide photos into the binder for a while, then said, "You are building a case." "I am building a record," I told him. "Same thing, just with less television music." Pete laughed, but then his face grew serious. "You know she has done this to other people, right?" I looked up. He nodded toward the street. Mrs. Carver got fined for having wind chimes. The Kesslers got a warning because their grandson left a basketball hoop at the end of the drive for one weekend. She tried to make the Ruiz family remove that little memorial bench they put under the oak tree after their boy died. I stopped what I was doing. "She tried to remove a memorial bench." Pete nodded slowly. "Said it was not in the approved landscape plan. Mr. Ruiz told her he would rather sell the house than ask his wife to carry that bench inside." I sat back on my stool and thought about that for a long moment. Suddenly, the Mercedes outside my driveway was not just about me. It was part of a pattern, the same pattern Vanessa had used on anyone who did not bend the right way when she pushed. I asked Pete why no one had challenged her before. He looked down at the root beer in his hands. "Because people have lives, Graham. They have jobs, kids, health problems, bills. Most folks do not have the energy to fight someone who treats a homeowner association like a personal kingdom." That stayed with me. I did not sleep much that night. I sat at the kitchen table under the yellow light Elisa picked out years ago, reading through the HOA rules, old meeting notes, road access documents, and every ugly little letter Vanessa had sent me since she became president. I had never cared much for paperwork. I like things you can hold in your hands. A bolt either fits or it does not. A carburetor either works or it does not. But paper has its own kind of machinery. Rules connect to rules. Dates connect to decisions. People count on you getting tired before you find the loose thread. I read until after midnight, glasses sliding down my nose, coffee going cold beside my elbow. Then I found something that made me sit up straight. Years before Vanessa ever moved into Briarwood Cove, the developer had written a special access clause into the neighborhood documents. It was dry, dull language, the sort of thing nobody reads unless they have a reason, but the meaning was clear enough. Every homeowner had the right to safe and reasonable access to their own property. Repeated obstruction of that access could be reported as a civil nuisance, especially when it was documented as intentional and ongoing. It was not a magic answer. It did not give me permission to do whatever I wanted. But it meant Vanessa's favorite phrase, common curb space, was not the end of the conversation. The next morning, I called a local attorney named Nora Bell. I knew her name because she had helped the Ruiz family with the memorial bench issue the year before. Her office was in an old brick building downtown, above a bakery that always smelled like cinnamon and burned butter. Nora was maybe in her 50s. Silver hair cut short, sharp eyes, no wasted words. Her desk was covered with files, but everything on it looked exactly where it belonged. I liked her immediately. I explained the whole story, starting with the budget meeting, then the warnings, then the parking, then the photos. I expected her to look bored somewhere around photo number 20. Instead, she leaned forward. By the time I showed her the picture of Vanessa staring into my camera after parking, she put down her pen. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. 26 days, I said. 26 consecutive days. There were 2 mornings she did not park there, I said. One was a Sunday and the other she was out of town. Nora leaned back in her chair. "That is not casual parking, Mr. Weller." "No," I said. "It is not." She flipped through the letters Vanessa had sent me, then paused at one where she had cited a section of the HOA rules about visible vehicle maintenance. "Did the board vote on this fine?" she asked. "Not that I know of." "Did they vote on the others?" "No." "Did you ever receive a hearing?" "No." Nora looked up at me. "Then she may have a problem bigger than your driveway." I felt something in my chest loosen. Not relief exactly. More like the first turn of an engine after you have spent all day trying to diagnose why it will not start. Nora explained that I needed to stay calm, stay clean, and stay on the right side of every line. She told me not to touch Vanessa's car. She told me not to threaten her. She told me not to say anything in anger that could be played back later in a meeting. Then she drafted a formal notice for me, addressed to Vanessa, the board, and the HOA management company. It was not dramatic. That was the beauty of it. It laid out the dates, the photos, the safety concern, the access clause, and the evidence of possible targeted harassment. It demanded that the behavior stop immediately. It also notified the board that any future citations against me would be challenged and reviewed for proper approval. Nora handed me the papers and said, "People like Miss Crowley confuse confidence with authority. Let us find out how much authority she actually has." I sent the notice by certified mail that afternoon. I sent copies to every board member. I sent one to the management company. Then I waited. For 2 whole days, Vanessa did not park in front of my driveway. On the first morning, I stepped outside and almost laughed because I could back straight out like a normal person. No 3-point turn, no mirror folded in, no tightness in my chest. Just a clear driveway and the sun coming up through the maple leaves. I stood there longer than I needed to, looking at the open street. That is the thing about peace. You do not always realize how much you miss it until it comes back. On the 3rd morning, I found a white envelope taped to my front door. It was from the HOA. I opened it standing right there on the porch. The letter informed me that I was being fined $200 for hostile conduct toward a board officer and another $100 for improperly documenting residence without consent. I read it twice. Then I laughed so hard I had to set my coffee down. Improperly documenting residence without consent. Vanessa had been filming people with a doorbell camera for 2 years, but now she had decided a man taking pictures from his own property was a crime against civilization. I called Nora. She read the letter over the phone, went quiet for a second, then said, "Do not pay it." I was not planning to. Good. Also, do not respond directly. Forward it to me. "What are you thinking?" I asked. "I am thinking Mrs. Crowley may have just put in writing that she does not understand the rules she keeps threatening everyone with." That afternoon, 3 different neighbors came by my house. Mrs. Carver brought a plate of lemon bars. The Ruiz family came together, which surprised me because Mr. Ruiz usually avoided HOA conversations like they were contagious. And then even Mr. Hanley showed up, holding a manila folder against his chest. He stood at the end of my driveway for a moment, looking nervous. "I should have said something sooner," he told me. At the meeting, I did not make him explain. I knew why he had stayed quiet. He had been on the board for years, and Vanessa had made everyone feel like disagreeing with her was the same as causing trouble. He handed me the folder. Inside were copies of old meeting minutes, emails, and financial statements. "She has been issuing violations without a vote," he said. "She has been approving contracts without the full board." I told her it was not right. She told me I was too old to understand how things work now. I looked at the papers, then at him. "Why bring these to me?" "Because you were the first person who did not back down," he said. "And because I am tired of being embarrassed by someone who thinks a clipboard makes her important." For the first time, the binder on my workbench no longer felt like one old man's private defense. It felt like the beginning of something bigger. Over the next week, Nora filed a formal complaint with the management company and requested a review of every violation Vanessa had issued without board approval. She also sent a demand to the HOA requiring them to preserve emails, meeting records, financial documents, and correspondence related to my property. That word preserve had a nice sound to it. Calm, professional, terrifying to anyone with something to hide. Vanessa got the letter on a Thursday afternoon. I know because I watched the mail carrier hand it to her. She signed for it with one quick slash of a pen, glanced at the envelope, and walked inside. 10 minutes later, her front door opened so hard it hit the siding. She came marching across the street. No dog, no tumbler, no polished smile. Just Vanessa, pure and unfiltered. "You went to a lawyer?" she asked. I was sitting in the porch swing, sanding an old wooden planter box. "Good afternoon to you too," I said. "You went behind the board's back and hired a lawyer." "I did not go behind anyone's back," I said. "I copied the board." "You were trying to intimidate me." "No, Vanessa. I am trying to stop you from intimidating me." She stepped up onto my walkway. "You have no idea what you are doing." I set the sandpaper down. "That is possible, but I have a lawyer who does." Her cheeks turned red. "You think this makes you some kind of hero?" "No," I said. "I think it makes me a homeowner who wants to use his driveway." She pointed toward my garage. "You have turned this whole neighborhood against me." That almost made me feel sorry for her, because she truly believed it. She thought people had turned against her because someone had finally told them to. She did not understand that they had been waiting for years to say what they already felt. I stood up slowly, not to threaten her. I am not a big man, and at my age I have no interest in trying to look like one. But I wanted her to hear me clearly. Vanessa, nobody turned this neighborhood against you. You did that every time you sent a fine without a vote. Every time you talked down to someone. Every time you used rules to settle a personal score. I just stopped pretending I could not see it. For a second, I thought she might slap me. Instead, she laughed, but there was no humor in it. You are going to regret this. Then she turned, walked back across the street, got into her Mercedes, and drove away. I thought maybe that was the end of the parking. I thought maybe the lawyer letter had finally reached whatever part of her mind still understood consequences. I was wrong. The next morning was Saturday. I woke up early, made coffee, and stepped onto the porch. There it was, her Mercedes. Not just in front of my driveway, but closer than it had ever been. She had parked so near the pavers that I could not have backed out without risking the side of my truck. And taped to the inside of her windshield was a bright yellow piece of paper. At first, I thought it was a note for me. Then I walked closer and read it through the glass. HOA notice. Graham Weller is prohibited from contacting, photographing, or interfering with Vanessa Crowley or her vehicle. Any further harassment will result in additional fines and possible legal action. I stood there in the morning light, reading that ridiculous piece of paper, and something in me became very still. She had received a formal legal notice from my attorney. She had been told the board was being reviewed. She knew her actions were being documented. And instead of stopping, she had come back to my house and placed a warning on the car she was using to obstruct my driveway. That was not confidence. That was panic wearing expensive sunglasses. I went inside, called Nora, and read the notice to her word for word. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do not touch the vehicle. Do not move it. Send me a photo of the notice, the car position, and your current inability to leave your driveway." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," she said, "we find out whether Ms. Crowley is willing to put her mistake in front of a judge." I took the pictures. I sent them. I made another pot of coffee. And then, as I stood at the kitchen window watching the Mercedes sit across the mouth of my driveway like a challenge, Pete called from across the street. "Graham," he said, "you might want to look outside." I stepped back onto the porch. 2 more cars had pulled up behind Vanessa's Mercedes, then another. People were parking along the curve, walking toward my house, holding folders, envelopes, printed emails, old fine notices, photographs of their own. Mrs. Carver came first, leaning on her cane, carrying a stack of letters from Vanessa. Behind her came the Ruiz family, then the Kesslers, then Mr. Hanley. One by one, they crossed the street and placed their paperwork on the table beside my porch swing. Nobody said much at first. They did not have to. The silence said enough. Then Pete looked at the blocked driveway, looked at the crowd gathering in front of my house, and said, "Well, Graham, I guess she finally parked in front of the wrong man." I looked at Vanessa's Mercedes, then at the binder, then at the small crowd of neighbors who had spent too long being polite to someone who never deserved it. Across the street, the blinds in Vanessa's living room moved. She was watching. She knew something had shifted, and she still had no idea how far it was about to go. That night, after the neighborhood had gone quiet and the last neighbor had carried their folder home, I stood alone in my garage with the blue binder open on the workbench. Nora had called before sunset. She had a plan. A legal one, a careful one, and she told me exactly one thing before hanging up. "Graham, do not do anything emotional tonight." I looked through the open garage door toward the dark shape of Vanessa's Mercedes still sitting too close to my driveway, and I smiled despite myself. Emotional was the last thing I felt. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm. At 1:47 in the morning, I turned off the kitchen light, put on my work gloves, and opened the garage door. At 1:47 in the morning, I opened my garage door, pulled on my work gloves, and stepped into the cool dark with every intention of doing exactly what Nora told me to do, which was nothing emotional. That is important, because later Vanessa would tell anyone willing to listen that I had spent the night plotting revenge, that I had been out there sharpening tools and whispering to myself like some retired villain in a bad movie. The truth was a lot less dramatic, at least at first. I did not touch her Mercedes. I did not go near it. I did not leave a note, scratch a panel, let the air out of a tire, or do any of the foolish things people suggested after the story got around. What I did was roll my own truck deeper into the garage, clear out the bags of mortar and paver stone that had been sitting along the sidewall since winter, and get ready for a repair I'd been putting off for almost a year. The hard rain back in February had washed out part of the drainage channel on the edge of my driveway, and two of the stones near the curb had settled just enough to create a low spot where water collected. It was not dramatic, but it mattered to me. Elise used to say that a house starts talking to you when something is wrong, and it was up to you to listen before it started yelling. I had already hired a small local crew to fix the drainage and reset the pavers, and the city had approved a temporary work zone along the curb for the morning because the equipment had to come in from the street. It was real work, real paperwork, real permits, and it had been scheduled before Vanessa ever taped that ridiculous yellow warning to her windshield. Nora had looked over everything and said, "You have the right to repair your own property, you have the right to a safe exit. Just make sure every step is documented. Every instruction comes from the contractor or the city, and you do not become the story." I remember saying, "What if she parks there anyway?" Nora paused, then said, "Then she makes the choice. Not you." That was all I needed to hear. By 5:30, the first hint of light was pushing through the trees at the end of Laurel Ridge Lane. Pete came over in his robe, sandals, and a baseball cap that said, "I would rather be fishing," which I had seen him wear to funerals, hardware stores, and one memorable HOA meeting where Vanessa tried to ban political signs. He held 2 travel mugs and handed me one without asking. "Coffee," he said, "for moral support." "You are awake early," I told him. "I am old," he said. "At this age, sleeping past 5 is either a luxury or a medical event." We stood quietly near the garage while the contractor's pickup rolled in, followed by a small trailer carrying equipment and stacks of stone. The foreman was a broad-shouldered woman named Marla, who had done work for half the houses in Briarwood Cove. She knew everyone, which meant she knew Vanessa too. She checked the permit, walked the length of the curb, set up the required work markers, and looked at the Mercedes sitting close to my driveway. "Is that going to move?" she asked. "It usually leaves around 6, I said. "Usually," Pete repeated. "That sounds optimistic." At 6,008, right on schedule, Vanessa came out of her house in sleek black workout clothes and climbed into the Mercedes. She did not look toward my driveway at first. Then she saw the bright work markers, the contractor's truck, the stacks of pavers, and the posted notice at the curb. She paused with one hand on the door. Even from across the street, I could see the calculation running behind her sunglasses. She looked at me. I looked back. She said nothing. Then she got into the Mercedes and drove away. Pete let out a breath. "Well," he said, "maybe hell froze over." I shook my head. "No, she is just going to come back angry." Marla looked at me. "You want us to get it started while she is gone?" "Please," I said. So they did. The old stones came up. The damaged drainage edge was opened, and for the first time in months, I could see how much water had gotten beneath the surface. It was funny in a way. From the street, the driveway had looked fine. But underneath, the foundation had been slowly washing out. I stood there watching the crew work. I could not help thinking about Vanessa, about how much of Briarwood Cove had looked normal from the outside while everyone underneath it had been quietly worn down. Around 7:12, we heard the low hum of the Mercedes coming around the bend. Pete looked at me, then at the street. "Showtime," he muttered. Vanessa slowed as she approached her house. The work zone was obvious. The curb in front of my driveway had marked boundaries, cones, equipment, a contractor's truck, and a bright posted notice that said no parking during authorized repair work. You did not need to be a lawyer or a city inspector to understand it. You just needed eyes. She stopped beside the work area for a moment, and I watched her through the windshield. She could have parked in front of her own house. She could have used the visitor spaces. She could have parked 50 feet away and walked home without losing a thing except the little thrill she got from making my life harder. Instead, she drove past her empty driveway, turned around at the end of the cul-de-sac, and came back. Then, with every available place in the neighborhood open to her, Vanessa Crowley eased that Mercedes right into the posted work zone in front of my driveway. She parked close enough to the equipment that Marla had to stop the crew. The engine clicked off. Vanessa got out, adjusted her sunglasses, and looked at the sign as if it had personally offended her. I walked toward the edge of my property but stayed back from the curb. I did not need to say much. I did not want to say much. Marla beat me to it. "Mom," she called, calm but firm, "we need that area clear. The repair has already started." Vanessa turned toward her. "This is a residential street." "Yes, Mom. And that is common curb space." Marla glanced at the permit taped to the contractor truck, then back at Vanessa. Not during the authorized work window. Vanessa gave a short laugh. I am the HOA president. I know what common property is. Pete, standing behind me with his coffee, whispered, "Here we go." Vanessa pointed at me. "He arranged this. He is trying to trap me." I looked at her and said, "I arranged to fix my driveway, Vanessa. You arranged the rest." Her jaw tightened. "You do not get to tell me where I can park." "I am not telling you," I said. "The posted work zone is." She marched toward the Mercedes, but instead of moving it, she pulled her phone out and started recording us. She aimed the camera at me first. "This is harassment," she said loudly. "This is a targeted attempt to intimidate a board officer." Then she swung the phone toward Marla. "I will be reporting this company." Marla did not raise her voice. "You are free to report whatever you like, Mom, but we cannot continue work with the vehicle in the marked area." Vanessa smiled at her in that same cold way she used at board meetings. "Then do not continue." There was a silence after that. Even the crew stopped moving. Then Marla took out her phone, called the city contact listed on the permit, and explained the situation in the few clear sentences. Vanessa stood there with her arms folded, looking almost pleased with herself, like she had just found another way to prove that nobody could make her do anything. A little while later, a parking enforcement officer arrived in a white city vehicle. He was not young, not nervous, not impressed by titles, and he had the tired expression of a man who had spent 20 years listening to people explain why rules did not apply to them. He read the permit, looked at the signs, measured the position of the Mercedes, and asked Vanessa whether she was the driver. She said yes. Then she launched into a speech about HOA jurisdiction, common space, homeowner rights, targeted harassment, and me trying to manipulate city resources because I was bitter about a parking dispute. The officer listened without interrupting. When she finally stopped, he said, "Ma'am, this is a temporary no parking zone during permitted construction. You need to move the vehicle." Vanessa stared at him. "You are taking his side." "I am not taking anyone's side," he said. "I am enforcing a posted restriction." "This is absurd, maybe," he said, "but you still need to move it." She looked at me again. I could see it in her face. She wanted me to blink. She wanted me to come forward and give her something to fight with, some angry sentence, some ugly gesture, something she could take back to the board and say, "See, this is who he really is." So I did the one thing that made her angrier than anything else could have. I took a sip of coffee. "Move the car, Vanessa," I said quietly. "Then nobody has a problem." She took one step toward me. "You think you've won something?" "No," I said. "I think you have about 60 seconds to make a smart choice." That was probably the sharpest thing I said to her through the whole mess, and I have thought about it since. Maybe I should have said nothing. Maybe I should have walked away. But after weeks of watching her smile while I squeezed my truck out of my own driveway, after watching her turn a neighborhood into a place where people whispered instead of spoke, I wanted her to hear one honest sentence from someone she could not scare. Vanessa did not move the car. She called someone, paced in a circle, and kept looking at the officer like he was going to suddenly remember she was special. He was not. When the tow truck arrived, it came slowly around the curve, its amber lights flashing in the early sun. The whole street seemed to wake up at once. Curtains shifted. Screen doors opened. Mrs. Carver came out with her cane and her cardigan. The Ruiz family stood near their porch. Mr. Hanley appeared in the same shirt he had worn to the last board meeting, like he had slept in it, waiting for this day. Vanessa's voice rose as the tow operator spoke with the officer. "You cannot tow my car. I am the HOA president." The tow operator looked at the permit, looked at the officer, then looked at Vanessa. "Ma'am, I just tow what I am authorized to tow." She pointed at me again. "He did this because I challenged him." I looked at the Mercedes, then at her. "You challenged me by blocking my driveway every morning. That is not what this is about." "No," I said. "It never was." The Mercedes was loaded onto the truck without damage, without drama from anyone except Vanessa, and without me putting a hand on it. Still, I will tell you this, watching that car roll away was one of the strangest moments of my life. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel cruel. I felt tired. Tired in the way you feel after holding a heavy box for too long and finally setting it down. Vanessa stood near the curb, phone in one hand, keys in the other, watching the truck disappear past the mailbox cluster. Her face had gone pale beneath her makeup. For the first time since she moved into Briarwood Cove, she looked less like a queen and more like a person who had pushed too hard and realized the ground beneath her was not as solid as she thought. And she turned toward me and said, "This is not over." I nodded. "No," I said. "It is not." She was right about that. The towing was not the ending. It was only the moment everything stopped being private. By lunchtime, someone had posted a short video of the tow truck leaving the street. I have no idea who did it. Pete insists it was not him, and I believe him only because he is too proud to lie badly. The video spread through the neighborhood faster than any official HOA notice ever had. By that evening, Nora had received copies of messages Vanessa sent to several board members accusing me of orchestrating a campaign of harassment. She demanded an emergency board meeting. She wanted sanctions. She wanted my access to HOA communications restricted. She wanted me fined for the tow. I read the email at my kitchen table and laughed once, quietly. Not because it was funny, because it was so completely Vanessa. She'd driven into a posted work zone, ignored a city officer, refused to move her car, and somehow decided she was still the victim. Nora called me that night. "She is going to force a meeting," she said. "Good," I told her. "You sound calm," she said. "I am. You should know this could get ugly." I looked toward the window. The drainage repair was finished. The pavers had been reset. Water would flow where it was supposed to flow. The driveway looked almost exactly the way it had when Elise and I first had it done, only cleaner somehow. "It has been ugly for a long time," I said. "Now people are just looking at it." The emergency meeting was held 3 nights later in the community room behind the library. Usually those meetings drew maybe 10 people, most of them board members and whoever had been fined that month. That night, every chair was filled. People stood along the back wall. Some sat on the floor near the doorway. The room smelled like old carpet, coffee, raincoats, and the kind of tension you could taste. Vanessa arrived late, which I think she did on purpose. She wanted the room to notice her. She wore a navy blazer, a gold necklace, and the expression of someone walking into a courtroom where she expected to be cleared before anyone heard the evidence. Her lawyer was beside her, a young man in a clean suit who looked like he had not been told the whole story. Nora sat next to me with a legal pad and a stack of folders. Pete sat behind us. Mrs. Carver sat in the front row with her hands folded over her cane. The Ruiz family sat together near the aisle. Mr. Wiz family sat together near the aisle. Hanley looked like he had aged 5 years since the last meeting, but there was something steady in his face now. Vanessa opened with a speech. Of course she did. She said the neighborhood had been divided by hostility. She said he had been subjected to intimidation. She said I had used construction work and local enforcement to humiliate her in public. For a few minutes I almost believed she might pull it off. She had a talent for making every sentence sound reasonable when you ignored the part where she had caused the problem. Then she said, Mr. Lair, when has made it impossible for me to perform my duties as HOA president?" And Nora stood up. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Before we discuss Mr. Weller," she said, "we need to discuss whether Miss Weller," she said, "we need to discuss whether Miss Crowley has been performing those duties lawfully." You could have heard a paperclip fall. Nora handed copies of a timeline to every board member. 26 days of parking records, photos, messages, the certified notice, the unauthorized fine letters, the unauthorized fine letters, the fake HOA warning Vanessa had taped to her own windshield. Then she placed a second folder on the table. "These are board minutes and financial records provided by current and former board members," she said. "They show that a number of violation notices were issued without a board vote, without hearings, and in some cases without proper notice to homeowners." Vanessa's lawyer leaned toward her and whispered something. Her face changed, not all at once, but enough. Nora continued. "They also show that the landscaping contract Ms. Crowley pushed for was awarded to a company owned by a close relative, despite the board never voting to approve that contract." Vanessa stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. "That is completely irrelevant." Nora looked at her. "It is relevant because Mr. Weller objected to that contract at the same meeting where this conflict appears to have begun." I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. There it was, the thing I had suspected, but never heard said aloud. The driveway was not random. The warnings were not random. Vanessa had been punishing me because I embarrassed her in front of the board and threatened the little empire she had been building. She had not chosen my driveway because it was convenient. She had chosen it because it mattered to me. Mr. Hanley cleared his throat. His hands were shaking, but his voice was not. "I was there when she proposed that contract," he said. "I asked for other bids. She told me I did not understand modern property management. When Graham raised the question again, she told us he was being disruptive." Vanessa turned toward him. "You agreed with me." Mr. Hanley looked straight at her. "No, I failed to disagree with you." That landed harder than shouting ever could have. Then Mrs. Carver stood. She moved slowly, and for a second I worried she might lose her balance, but Mr. Ruiz stepped forward to offer his arm. She shook her head and waved him off. "I can stand," she said. Her voice was small at first, then stronger. "I am 78 years old. I have lived here since before that pond had fish in it. I was fined because my wind chimes were too loud. A pond had fish in it. I was fined because my wind chimes were too loud. I took them down because I did not want trouble. My husband bought those chimes for me before he died. I took them down because I was afraid of a letter." The room got quiet in a different way then. Not tense, ashamed. Mr. Ruiz stood next. He talked about the memorial bench for his son. The Kesslers talked about the memorial bench for his son. The Kesslers talked about the basketball hoop. A young mother named Tasha described getting 3 notices because chalk drawings from her kids were visible near the sidewalk. One by one, people spoke. None of it was dramatic by itself. That was the terrible part. It was small things, ordinary things. A wind chime, a bench, a basketball hoop, a recycle bin, a driveway. But when you stack enough small humiliations on top of each other, they become a wall. Vanessa sat there listening, and I watched her face. At first she looked angry, then defensive, then tired. Her lawyer whispered again. She shook her head. Finally, when the room got quiet, she stood up and said, "You are all acting like I did something terrible because I tried to maintain standards." Pete muttered behind me, "Here comes the apology." But there was no apology. Vanessa looked around the room and said, "Someone has to care about this neighborhood. Someone has to make decisions. You all want order until you are asked to follow it." That was the moment I understood something about her that I had missed before. Vanessa did not think she was a bully. Not really. She thought she was necessary. She thought without her, people would leave trash cans in the street, paint their houses bright orange, let grass grow knee-high, and turn Briarwood Cove into the kind of place she had spent her life trying to escape. Maybe she had lived through chaos somewhere. Maybe she had been powerless once. Maybe control was the only thing that made her feel safe. I will never know. But whatever fear she had carried into our neighborhood, she had handed pieces of it to everyone else. I stood up then. I had not planned to speak. Nora had told me I did not have to. But I looked at the people in that room, at Mrs. Carver, at the Ruiz family, at Mr. Hanley sitting with his hands clenched in his lap, and I felt like silence would be another kind of cowardice. "Vanessa," I said, "nobody is against standards. Nobody wants a broken-down neighborhood. But standards without respect are just control. And control without accountability turns into fear." She looked at me with tears in her eyes, though whether they were tears of anger or humiliation, I could not tell. "You ruined me over a parking space," she said. I shook my head. "No. You started with a parking space because you thought it would ruin me." There was no applause. I was grateful for that. Real life is not a courtroom movie. People did not leap to their feet. They just sat there breathing, letting the truth settle into the room. After a closed discussion, the board voted to remove Vanessa as president pending a full review of the records. Her authority to issue violations was suspended immediately. The unauthorized fines against me and several other residents were withdrawn. The landscaping contract was cancelled before any money changed hands. An outside accountant was brought in to review the HOA books. Vanessa left before the meeting ended. She walked past me without looking up, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor, and for a second I thought she might say something. She did not. The door shut behind her, and everyone in the room sat in silence for a moment, almost unsure what to do with the space she had left behind. The months after that were quieter than I expected. Vanessa tried to sue me over the towing incident, but her attorney withdrew the claim after Nora provided the permit, the city records, the officer report, and the video showing Vanessa refusing to move the car. The city did not issue her any special punishment beyond the tow and fees, and I was glad for that. I never wanted her crushed. I wanted her stopped. There is a difference. The HOA audit took longer. It found enough irregularities to embarrass the board, but not enough to turn our little neighborhood into a headline. The important thing was that the rules changed. Fines required a vote. Hearings had to be offered. Hearings had to be offered. Contracts needed competing bids. Meeting notes had to be available to every homeowner. And maybe best of all, people started talking to one another again. Pete put his lawn chair near the sidewalk most evenings, which he claimed was not socializing because he was just sitting outside. Mrs. Carver hung her wind chimes back up. The Kesslers put a basketball hoop out for their grandkids. The Ruiz family cleaned up the memorial bench and planted little blue flowers around it. I fixed the last loose stone on my driveway myself one Saturday morning, and as I was brushing sand into the joints, I heard the chimes across the street move in the breeze. It was a small sound, but it felt like the whole neighborhood exhaling. Vanessa stayed in Briarwood Cove for another 3 months. I would see her sometimes, carrying groceries, checking the mail, getting into a rental car after the Mercedes came back from the impound lot. She looked different without the title. Smaller, maybe. Not physically. Just less armored. One grey afternoon in November, she came over to my porch. I was sitting in the yellow swing Elise had painted years ago, wearing an old flannel shirt and pretending I was reading the newspaper. I saw Vanessa at the end of the walkway and waited. She stood there for a long time before speaking. "I am moving," she said. I nodded. I heard. "People have been awful to me." I looked at her. "Some people have been honest with you." She gave a humorless little laugh. "You always have an answer." "No," I said. "I should have got tired of having none." She looked across the street at her house. The grey paint, the perfect front shrubs, the empty driveway. "You know what the worst part is?" she asked. I did not answer. I really thought I was helping. I thought people needed someone to keep things from falling apart. For a moment I saw a version of her that was not the woman with the clipboard, not the woman who stood outside my driveway smiling while I fought to leave my own home. Just a tired person who had built her whole identity around being in charge and did not know who she was without it. I could have been cruel then. Part of me wanted to be. But Elise had taught me something about kindness, and it was not that kindness means pretending harm never happened. It means saying the truth without trying to make a wound deeper. So I said, keeping things from falling apart is not the same as holding everyone down. Vanessa looked at me for a while. Then she nodded once. "I guess I learned that late." "Most people do," I said. "Most people do," I said. She did not apologize. Not really. She said she was sorry things had gotten out of hand, which is not the same thing, but maybe it was the closest she knew how to come. Then she walked back across the street. A few weeks later, a for sale sign went up in her yard. By January, a young couple named Ben and Lila moved in with a toddler, a golden retriever, and a habit of leaving bicycles on the lawn for an hour too long. Nobody complained, not once. These days, I still wake up early. Old habits do not leave just because the trouble does. I make coffee. I step onto the porch. I look down at the grey pavers, Elise, and I chose all those years ago. The driveway is clear. The street is quiet. Sometimes Pete waves from across the road. Sometimes Mrs. Carver's wind chimes carry through the morning air. And sometimes I think about Vanessa Crowley, about that tow truck, that board meeting, that look on her face when she realized she could not shout her way out of consequences. Was I right to let it go as far as it did? I do not know. I ask myself that more often than people probably expect. I did not damage her car. I did not threaten her. I did not invent a trap. But I knew she would not back down, and I knew the repair permit gave the city a line she could not argue past. Maybe that makes me patient. Maybe it makes me patient. Maybe it makes me both. What I know is this: you cannot build peace by letting the loudest person decide where everyone else is allowed to stand. Sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to stop giving them the comfort of your silence. So tell me what you think. Did Graham do the right thing by letting Vanessa face the consequences of her own choices? Or did he take the driveway war too far? Was it justice? Was it revenge? Or was it something messier in between? Drop your opinion in the comments because I have a feeling this one is going to split the room. And if you enjoy stories where power gets challenged, truth gets documented, and quiet people finally stop being pushed around, subscribe and share this with someone who has ever had to fight for peace in their own neighborhood.